and he caused the machine to play the last post. He then hit the power off button, the machine room went silent, and grown men were seen to weep.
People who tour these galleries often say, wow, I had no idea. Many think computing is about engineers and mathematicians. But if you've ever talked to Siri or texted a friend, you know computing is about you. Sir Maurice Wilkes is a legendary figure in modern computing. In 1948, the EDSAC computer designed by Wilkes first ran at Cambridge University. It sparked stunning and rapid computing advances. Dr. David Hartley was a friend, colleague, and student of Sir Maurice. He joined me recently to remember Sir Maurice Wilkes and EDSAC, the man and his machine.
This is just a list, because they went by so quickly, of the accomplishments and awards of Maurice Wilkes over his career. I mean, just look at that. The Turing Award in 1967, the Harry Good Award, being made a Foreign Associate of the Distinguished U.S. Academies, the Faraday Medal, the CNC Prize in Tokyo, being made an ACM Fellow, the von Neumann Medal, knighthood in 2000, a Fellow here in the IEEE 60th Anniversary Award, and his many honorary degrees. I mean, what an incredibly distinguished life and career. And I would like, David, for you to start right at the beginning. So why don't you tell us a little bit about his boyhood and his school?
Yeah. As a boy, he was very encouraged by his father to have an interest in electronics. And he built his own radio transmitter and was allowed to operate it at home. I think it's quite a privilege. But then in 1931, he went to Cambridge as a student in mathematics. He entered St. John's College. And I have a quote from him. I've got many quotes to say tonight. He said, "I rather deliberately avoided getting too deeply involved with amateur radio in Cambridge, since I felt there were so many other things to do." A typical Maurice statement. But he held the license for the amateur radio student station in Cambridge while he was a student.
And of course there, he meets and becomes acquainted with Alan Turing.
Well, Alan Turing was there at the same time, and indeed he did meet him. But again, I got some quotations from him, from Wilkes. Turing was not at St. John's College, he was at King's College, and being at different colleges did make some difference. Maurice said, "Turing and I took the mathematical tripos in 1934, but I do not have a clear recollection of him from those years." That was a rather defensive statement. But in a recent interview published in the ACM Communications, you may have seen, he said, "Alan Turing was an exact contemporary of mine, and that means I don't have to regard him as a great man, because you don't regard your contemporaries as great men." That's a wonderful cop-out from a question which said, "You didn't like Turing, did you?" He said, "We took the tripos together, and we both got the highest honours, so that was all right." Then separately he said, "I liked Turing. We got on very well together. He liked to lay down the law, and that didn't endear him to me." I can imagine that. People sometimes say I didn't get on with Turing, but it's just not true. But then I was very careful not to get involved. He was not in any sense a team leader. He didn't know how to get things done. So that deals with Alan Turing.
So what aroused his interest in computing?
Well, he went to a lecture by Douglas Hartley, who was a very important professor of mathematics in those days, and very much involved with computing as then was, which was the hand calculation using mechanical machines. And Hartley gave a lecture on the differential analyzer, which had been made out of Meccano, of course, and as Maurice said, he found it irresistible. And I think that set the pattern for much of what Maurice did after that. But in 1937, the university had a report written on the need to establish a computing laboratory. They called it the Mathematical Laboratory, and its job was to acquire a differential analyzer and other mechanical calculators, and to provide a service to scientists doing computations. It was known as the Maths Lab, but as Maurice said, it took 33 years for the university to put that right and call it the Computer Lab. and that was important to him. But I think they probably called it the Maths Lab to appease the mathematicians, so they felt it was part of them. They appointed a part-time director, a theoretical chemist professor, to be in charge of the lab, and Maurice was the first employee, as it said. He was in charge day to day, he had a small salary, and he provided technical assistance to for research computations. His grade in the university was that of demonstrator, which is a quaint Cambridge term for associate professor. But before this could get established, 1939 came and World War II began, and he had a phone call from Sir John Cockcroft. You may have heard the name John Cockcroft. He was head of the atomic energy research work for civil atomic energy after the war. And he reports to Maurice this phone call. Cockcroft speaking, can you be at the Air Ministry at 19:30 hours on Thursday morning? Then Maurice says, I was not used to receiving such peremptory commands from Cockcroft, but I pulled myself together and said I would be there. So Maurice actually spent a very happy war, nothing to do with computing. He was installing radar sets around the British coastline. And he got involved also with a new subject called operational research. But when people say, about operational research, what is it? He said, well, it was drinking gin in the mess.
So the war ends in 1945, and what happens next?
Well, he came back to Cambridge, fairly smartish, but the director, the part-time director, was still doing his war service, so Maurice found himself the most senior member of staff. So they made him acting director. And there was a lot of talk at that time, about developing the ideas of computers. The ENIAC at the Moore School, of course, in Philadelphia, was the focus of much attention. The Moore School lectures happened, as you know, in 1946, and they were spread over quite a long time, a 2-month period, and Maurice received an invitation to go. I think this, again, was Douglas Hartley who arranged that. But getting to the States in 1946 was not easy. First of all, he had to get a visa, and then he had to find a ship, a boat, or something to get here. And in the end, he got a cargo vessel. And when he got on the cargo vessel, no one on the vessel knew where it was going and where it was going to land. Perhaps in New York City, they didn't know. And it broke down several times. And it took 2 weeks for him to get here. So by the time he arrived, the lectures were well underway. But nevertheless, he found them very enjoyable. And of course, the main thing that came out of the Moore School lectures, in Maurice's mind, was the EDSAC report written by John von Neumann. And this proposed the use of delay lines as a form of storage for instructions and data in a computer. Maurice immediately decided that this was the way forward, and that the days of analog machines, which were much debated in those days, were numbered. So he traveled back home, first on a train to Boston, and then on the Queen Mary back to Southampton. And during that journey, he sketched out the design of EDSAC. Back in Cambridge, he found he'd been appointed director of the Maths Lab, and he had complete freedom to do what he wanted. And he was inspired by the visit to the US, he was inspired by the EDVAC report, and he said, I knew how to build a computer. And what was more, the people in the Maths Lab who had not been to the Moore School didn't know how to build a computer. So he said he had complete freedom to make all the decisions. It didn't last, because he trained so many good people that in later years, whenever he had good ideas, the other people had sometimes even better ones. But he said, at the time, he said, I didn't have to ask anyone, may I build a computer? He was just allowed to do what he wanted. He didn't have to put in any proposal, he didn't have to arrange a budget, he was in charge, and he could just go ahead. He said the times were extremely abnormal. It will never happen today. So he set about the task. He named the computer EDSAC, which stands for Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, not computer. And he did this as a tribute to EDVAC. The fact the names are similar was a deliberate act on his part to say, thank you, EDVAC, for the ideas.
So tell us then about the EDSAC. How was it built? What were its main characteristics?
You have to understand Maurice's motives for this. When I mentioned earlier that he was inspired by Hartley, and he was appointed to a job to give a service to people in computation. And he had noticed the labor, the drudgery of doing calculations by hand, turning a handle of a Brunswiger and so on. And he set about building a machine because he wanted to help them. And he did more than help them, he transformed, of course, their lives. The machine had about 3,000 vacuum tubes in 12 racks. It had this delay line memory made out of tubes filled with mercury. There were 32 tubes. Each tube had 32 17-bit words, so 1,024 word memory for data and programs. It ran at about 650 or 700 instructions per second, and it had input from paper tape and output onto a teleprinter. Now you may say, and many people have said since, how slow, how small, what was the importance of EDSAC? It was such a slow machine compared with today. You've got to understand one very important thing. EDSAC replaced a human operator and a mechanical calculator. And this increased the power factor. The power factor increase from that technology to the electronic technology we reckon was roughly 1,500 times. Now that is arguably the largest jump forward in computer power, not only before or since, but also since.
When did EDSAC become operational, David?
Well, John, as you mentioned in your introduction, in fact, 62 years ago, last week, 6th of May, 1949, as Maurice says in his memoirs, rather suddenly, on the 6th of May, 1949, the machine read in a paper tape for computing a table of squares and printed the results. And he also said, we said prayers for reliability, for reliable answers. And he got them. It was reliable. Another quotation which I rather like is that in 1949, as soon as we started programming, we found to our surprise that it wasn't as easy to get programs right as we had thought. Debugging had to be discovered. I can remember the exact instant when I realized that a large part of my life from then on was going to be spent in finding mistakes in my own programs. Now, actually, being Maurice and being the boss, in years later, he got other people to find his mistakes for him.
Now, by being involved in history as long as you have, we use the word first somewhat advisedly, but I think it's in general agreement everywhere that EDSAC was the first electronic stored program computer to go into regular service. And I just wanted to ask you, how did that happen and what was it like when it happened?
As soon as the machine was working, he opened it up. He sent a memo around to many people in the university saying, in my words, not his, I've built an electronic calculator machine, please come and use it. Now, in those days when people pioneered the use of computers, they were rather frightened of users, might damage the machine. But Maurice said, no, come and use it. He did have one hurdle to use the machine. Anyone who wanted to have an allocation of computer time had to go before what they called a priorities committee. And it was a panel of staff in the lab, chaired by Maurice, where new applicants to use the computer would come and describe what they were trying to do and how they were going to do it. And the motive of letting them do that was then to advise them how best to do it. It wasn't to check, oh, we can't let you do that, and so on. Any likely project was always approved, but they were helped by this inquisition, if you like. And many programming techniques in that time were pioneered by users, by students, by staff, and so on. David Wheeler invented the subroutine. Now, enough said. Most fundamental improvement on programming techniques. But they also developed debugging techniques and ways of tracing problems and so on. At the same time, they instituted a series of seminars every Thursday afternoon. They would have a seminar on some subject of computing, and they were attended by people from all around the country. Almost anyone who was into computing in those days, the early 50s, went to the Cambridge Thursday seminars.
So what became of this machine that we see on our screen?
It transformed academic research in Cambridge. Of that there was no doubt. It enabled advances in science, enabled problems to be tackled that could never be thought of even, let alone attempted. It contributed to 2 Nobel Prizes. John Kendrew, molecular structure of myoglobin, and Martin Ryle, both since then knighted in radio astronomy. And even the big rival to Martin Ryle, Fred Hoyle, the astronomer, he mentions EDSAC in his science fiction novel, The Black Cloud. And if you read The Black Cloud, it describes the mass lab and the EDSAC computer and the instruction code in great detail in the middle of a science fiction novel. Anyway, by 1958, the machine had been operational for 9 years, the lab had started to build another computer, the EDSAC-2, much less well known. It was superior in every way to EDSAC. It was faster, it was bigger, more memory, it was nicer to use, and so naturally it took over the workload. There's no point in using EDSAC with this better machine there. So on the 11th of July 1958, they scrapped it. It was taking up valuable space. That room there and that thing was quite a big room, and they needed the space. So they threw it away. The odd chassis was kept, I think rather by accident than design. No thought of history. It was no longer needed. It was yesterday. And so that's what happened to EDSAC. It was thrown away.
And as with so many great machines, that was that.
Yeah. Well, not quite in a way, because you heard, those who were here at lunchtime, you heard about the EDSAC replica project. We've been promised funds to build a replica of EDSAC, and Kevin talked about that today. So EDSAC, I hope, will live.
So let's now move on to the post-EDSAC period and Sir Maurice's many achievements. So after EDSAC, there was EDSAC-2, and what were its essential qualities?
Well, EDSAC-2 was also another roomful of vacuum tubes. They were more advanced, these vacuum tubes. They were small ones, not big ones. But it contained many innovations over EDSAC, designed either by Maurice Wilkes or by David Wheeler. For example, Maurice discovered microprogramming, and EDSAC-2 was a microprogramming machine. It was a bit slice machine. That was an innovation. The picture you see there is of one of our engineers. That's a bit slice. That chassis he's pulled out of the rack is 1 bit of the arithmetic unit. And the rest of that unit are the other chassis around there. And those are interchangeable plug chassis. So if one chassis blew, you took it out, put another one in, bit sliced. It had 2 core memories. Its memory was magnetic cores. It's interesting, they still call it EDSAC-2 because quite late in the design, they thought they were going to use delay lines again, because the EDSAC, delay storage. But they didn't. In fact, when I became a student there, we spent a long time looking for the delay lines, and no one had told us that there was no delay lines. They got magnetic cores. And he had 2 core memories, a normal one, read-write, 1,024 40-bit words, and it had a second one, a read-only memory, in which were permanently stored mathematical functions, a symbolic assembler, magnetic control routines, and so on, and debugging routines. It had a rich instruction set. It had both fixed-point arithmetic and floating-point arithmetic. It had a very comprehensive instruction set. Its speeds, it took about 30 microseconds to do a floating-point add, 150, say, to do or a bit more, to do a multiply and divide. It was a dream to program. It was so well designed. And that, again, was part of the mission. Maurice wanted to enable the people to use computing. And it expanded the user base enormously.
And I gather this was about the time that you entered the picture through the Mass Lab.
Yes. A bit traumatic, that. I went to Cambridge to read mathematics, as Maurice had done before the war, and I thought I was quite clever. To get into Cambridge with maths, you have to be clever. But I discovered something after 2 years, that Cambridge mathematics is extremely difficult, unless you are very, very clever. And I wasn't very, very clever. I struggled for 2 years, and I got myself a second-class result in my examination. But I was no way I was going to do a 3rd year. in maths. So it was just no point, it would be a waste of time. So I had to, even though I got qualified for my degree, you had to be there 3 years to get your degree. So I had to find something to do for my third year. So I went to my tutors in my college and I said, help, what do I do? And we cast around and discovered this postgraduate course. It had a quaint title. It's called the Diploma in Numerical Analysis and Automatic Computing. It's since then been called the Diploma in Computer Science, because in those days we didn't call it computer science. And I did that course in my third year, and I enjoyed it. It was great. And when you enjoy something, you do well at it, and I did well at it. And so they said, you can do a PhD. I said, what's that? Oh, you do 3 years' work, write a thesis, get called doctor. It also got me out of the National Service. I was able to dodge the draft by doing it. That helped too. And I spent my PhD, in the end, writing a compiler for the EDSAC 2.
So it might be that anyone would be coming aboard at that time doing research, but how is it that you wound up with Maurice Wilkes as your research advisor?
It was somewhat by default and again accidental, like most of my career. When I said to Maurice, yes, I will do research, he said, well, you've got to find a subject to do. And I said, well, I fancy doing something in programming. I mean, programming languages were sort of being thought about and sort of existed. I said, that would be nice. And Maurice said, you can't do that. It's been done. Tony Brooker in Manchester had written an autocode, so it's been done. And, oh dear. And what happened in those days when people did research in computing is they tended to attach themselves to a particular application subject and do the programming for that subject, like theoretical chemistry or physics or mathematics or whatever. And they attached me to the high-energy physics group. Now, high-energy physicists are the last of the really big physicists, you know, they're very important. They were analyzing bubble chamber photographs, and I was sent off to lectures in physics, which I didn't understand a word. And I also discovered that the physicists themselves knew exactly how to program quite happily and didn't need me, thank you. So I nearly dropped out of it. I got so depressed until I discovered a visitor in the lab, one Harry D. Husky, of whom I'm sure you all know. Harry was on sabbatical in Cambridge at that term, and he got his Neliac language he was working on there in Cambridge, and I met him and we talked about it and that. And it was that caused Harry to persuade Maurice that I could do programming after all. So I'm very grateful to Harry Husky. And there I was.
So after EDSAC 2, then what? Was there an EDSAC 3?
Well, not really. In the 1960s, when EDSAC 2 had been in operation for a couple of years, Maurice started to plan the next machine. But by then, of course, there was a computer industry, and we thought, although it's fun to build machines, perhaps we ought to buy one and not just play around with hardware. But there was a problem. EDSAC 2 was so good, and its power was such that there were very few machines on the market that were worth buying, because they weren't powerful, the same power as EDSAC. There's no point in replacing EDSAC 2 with something the same size. Whereas the money he had from the government to buy his third machine was just right enough to buy one of those smaller machines. And there were only two machines that were worth looking at. One was the IBM 7090, and the other one was the Ferranti Atlas. You'll know about the 7090, you might know less about the Atlas. The problem was that both were horrendously expensive. We had nothing like the right amount of money. Maurice tried to persuade IBM to give us one, but even he couldn't charm IBM that way. And so IBM fell out. And in the end, we teamed up with Ferranti. Ferranti had built the Atlas in conjunction with Manchester University. And Ferranti decided that they wanted a smaller Atlas for their market. And David Wheeler was engaged in the project to build a smaller Atlas, of which we would have the prototype. And that's how we afforded to have the thing. We called it Titan because all Ferranti machines in those days were called after some mythical god. Perseus, Pegasus, Sirius, Atlas, and then Titan. Although, for those who know, Titan was eventually christened Atlas II because marketing people like to have a number in their names. So we had Titan. It was installed in 1963. EDSAC 2 was closed down and scrapped, of course. Yeah, don't need the space, in 1965. Now, users got very fond of old machines. They got to know to love them, their idiosyncrasies and so on. And they hated new machines because new machines were always late and the software never worked. And they said, we've got a new machine coming, it's going to be awful. So we never opened new machines because there were a lot of razzmatazz of people saying these marvelous things arrived, and of course it would actually be a load of junk for a few years. But what we did do, therefore, is we started to close old ones. And the picture you now have before you is of the crowd of the users in the machine room at the close-down ceremony. The Maurice, you can't see him in the picture, but that might be his head. No, he's not bald. Bottom left. He read in the last program, which is on a piece of paper tape, black of course, and he caused the machine to play the last post. He then hit the power off button, the machine room went silent, and grown men were seen to weep.
Have you ever seen a machine decommissioned with such emotion and ceremony?
Well, we did the same with Titan afterwards as well.
Did you?
Yes.
Great.
And we did the same with our first IBM mainframe in 1980 as well.
It became quite a tradition.
Oh, it was. Oh, yes. It was a nice one.
So then we're into the 1960s. Maurice continues his work rather, and discovers time sharing.
Yeah. That was traumatic as well. Maurice loved coming to the States, and he often was a visitor to MIT. And in about 65 or so, he visited MIT and saw the CTSS, the compatible time-sharing system that MIT had developed. And he came bouncing back to Cambridge, and he said, we've got to have time-sharing on Titan. It's the way of the future. Of course, he was dead right, as he always was. But at the time, Roger Needham and myself and one or two others were struggling to develop this darn operating system on Titan. We were late with it. It wasn't time-sharing, it was multi-programming batch processing. And we weren't quite receptive to stopping that development and stopping mid-development and adapting the system to time-sharing. We had inadequate hardware, we got no disk or anything. But Maurice insisted. He persuaded ICL to give him a disk. We persuaded David Wheeler to modify the machine a bit so that we could segment the store. And in fact, in 2 years, we had a time-sharing system. We changed mid-course. And all because Maurice said, you've got to have time-sharing. And he was absolutely right. And thereafter, feeding in paper tape or punch cards was a thing of the past. People sat at teletype terminals, and that's how they used computers thereafter. And at the same time, under Maurice's leadership, one or two academics, including myself, our careers and reputations were well established.
So this was an ongoing theme at Cambridge in the 1960s, the use of electronic computing to really transform the whole field of academic research.
Yeah.
So how long was this pursued? How long could it go on?
No, it couldn't, because politically, by the end of the 1960s, however good of a service we ran on these machines, and I'm a bit biased, of course, but they were good, it was politically untenable to conduct research into the development of computing services, or as the users put it, to continue experimenting on them. So there's a review. What happens, the university sets a committee up and writes a report, and they said things have to change. And they changed in 1970, when they divided the maths lab into two parts. They said what part of this is computer science, it's academic, it's research and teaching, and the other part is a computing service. And although it stayed one department, of which Maurice was the head, he was not responsible for the service, and they appointed a second director to run the service, and that director would report to a board in the university. And I became that second director. And so whereas all my career I'd been working for him, under him, or whatever, he became my colleague. And I worked alongside him. And that was very instructive. He was very kind to me in helping me become I was only 32 years old or something. I mean, I'd grown far too big, far too quickly. And but it was, in fact, to me, a very important stage in my career. And I was very grateful to him for what we did. On his side, research continued. Then they got into all sorts of new ideas. Earlier it was mentioned the CAP machine, the capability machine. There's a picture of it, homemade machine, just to try out the concept of capabilities. Capabilities is like segmentation. It's blocking out bits of memory and only let a process get at what it needs to get at and nothing else, in a way of getting much more secure operating systems. And typical Cambridge, they worked out the ideas, they built the machine to do it, and they wrote an operating system and so on. Research in Cambridge was very practical under Maurice. But at the same time, Maurice actually became quite a student of the history of computing, because in the 1970s became the centenary of Charles Babbage. And as Doran Swade has put it, he was the first modern scholar to study the manuscripts of Charles Babbage, which is true. And he gave a public lecture about Babbage in 1971, I think, which was a model. You know, he became a computer historian.
As we now know, looking back on it, a third of his life remaining, a generation's worth of work ahead of him, but he is required under Cambridge policy to retire at the age of 67. So tell us about that.
Yes, he was 67 years old by the end of the academic year 1979-80. So he duly retired from his chair and left the lab. He finished off his memoir, got it published. He was succeeded by Roger Needham. He packed up all the papers he had of the EDSAC and EDSAC 2 and deposited them in the archives. And Maurice had a strong affection for the USA. He was always over here. And ever since he visited the Law School lectures. And it seemed quite natural that he would emigrate. So he went to digital at Maynard. And he had a lovely time.
Now, so here he is, this slide. This is at that presentation that we just saw Gordon Bell introducing. And that's a chassis, right, from EDSAC?
Yes. We're not quite sure why he gave it away, but he did. We think you've got it somewhere.
And we still have it. We absolutely do. We're
it's interesting you won't show it to us.
We're proud it's here. We're very, very proud it's here.
Yeah.
How long did he stay in America, and what did he do at Digital? I just find it fascinating that he comes over, he goes to DEC. Of course, he meets Gordon. Tell us a little bit about that period.
He was here from 1980 to 86. And he joined the R&D group in Digital as a senior consulting engineer. And apparently, as such, he did interact over the whole DEC company. In 1982, he relocated with the Digital's East Coast researchers to Hudson. Now, that was the site of their semiconductor design and fabrication, which well suited him because he was fascinated by electronics and electronic design. And he discovered that they were using technologies and microprogramming technologies, for example, to build DEC machines, which just completely took and used his insights of 30 years previously. Also, his final contribution was he went to MIT and continued to, was actually a hands-on manager in the Athena project.
It's funny, we were talking before the program started tonight. One of our trustees, Ike Nassy, was at DEC at that time and had an office just a few doors away from Maurice, and was talking about how much he learned from him at that point, about the whole approach to computer design and problem solving. It's even then he was still teaching, wasn't he? He was still had a lot to contribute. So, but then he stays here for 6 years. He goes back to the UK in 1986. Now, why did he do that?
Maurice had for many years been a fellow of St. John's College, his college. There's a nice picture of it. And to come to the States, although he had retired from his university post, he still was a fellow of the college and something he much prized. And the rules of the college did not let fellows just disappear indefinitely. You had to get leave to go, and he could only get leave in 3-year pieces. So he got leave for 3 years, and then he got the leave renewed by the college. The college said, okay, you can stay again another 3 years. But after the second 3-year period, I think he was told fairly bluntly by the college that if he didn't come back, he wouldn't have his fellowship renewed. And to him, his fellowship was important. It's a thing about Cambridge and so on. And I believe that's why he came back, because he wanted to keep his fellowship.
So did he really retire? This is his second retirement. Was this the 1986? Was this the retirement?
No, of course not. He came back and joined a research lab which was run by Olivetti. Olivetti, the Italian company, had taken over Acorn, which was the company that had developed the BBC Micro, and Andy Hopper, who was then a researcher in the maths lab, in the computer lab then, got the job of running this research lab on behalf of Olivetti. And Maurice joined the lab and became a research advisor and had a job and so on, and participated in all their activities. He was also a member of the Olivetti Research Board, so he was high up in that company. The Olivetti Research changed its name, because it changed its ownership, to AT&T in 1999. But it closed in the year 2002 because AT&T was trying to pass the lab on to Intel, and it all fell through because the lawyers couldn't agree on the IPR. And so Andy Hopper said, right, we give up, and they formally made all the staff of the research lab redundant.
So there's this kind of lovely British phrase called being made redundant. I think we call it being laid off.
Okay, yeah.
Right? So at the age of 89, Maurice Wilkes was laid off or made redundant.
That's correct. All the staff, he was offered redundancy counseling. I don't think he took it. So finally, he came back to the computer lab in 2002. And until 2008, he regularly, every day, went to the lab, went to work. He studied current developments, he wrote papers, and he liked to meet the students. Every Friday in the lab, in today, they have a happy hour for the students, where someone gets a barrel of beer and they relax and so on. And Maurice would attend happy hour. You know, he liked talking to students.
So let's talk a little bit about your personal recollections. You were with him for 52 years. He was your teacher, he was your mentor, he was your friend. Tell us a little bit about David Hartley's view of Sir Maurice.
Yeah, well, he was my teacher, my research supervisor. Then he was my employer, my manager. And from 1970, as I said earlier, he was my colleague and so on. And then eventually he became my friend, although that took a long time. Particularly in the last years, I was a regular visitor to him. Not because he wanted me there, I think, but no one else would go and see him, because everyone else was either dead or not old enough. And saw him, didn't really know him, and they saw him in awe. Well, I saw him in awe, but I felt it was my duty to go and see him. And I spent quite a lot of time with him. He stopped going to the lab just a few months before Nina, his wife, died. And he never went back after that regularly. He went back for parties and things. When I was completing my PhD, I asked Maurice, pardon, Mr. Wilkes, I said, have you got any jobs available? I like it here. We were working on the Titan computer in those days, and when I finished my PhD, and I fancied the idea of having it, staying on. And I said to Maurice, any jobs? He said, well, sorry, no, we're full, unless somebody dies. But he found me a job. He was getting the Titan purchase, he was finding the money, raising money, and he was calculating how much he got and what he could get for it. And apparently, I didn't know about this at the time, he had just enough funds to buy the Titan with 7 tape drives. He decided to do it with 6 tape drives and hire me. And it's true. And he used to say later, I think on the whole we made the right choice. Another story about him, he wasn't made a professor until 1965. Cambridge didn't give people personal chairs then, and until they really could not do it. You know, you had to be right, you had to be totally, no question. So he was given a personal chair in 1965, and as with personal chairs, of course, you choose your own title. And he chose the title of Professor of Computer Technology. And people said, that's funny, why? Everyone else who got personal chairs all around the world were called Professors of Computer Science. And his reply always was this: I was once a scientist, and I know the difference.
you've told us a number of great stories like that over the last couple of days, and you've also mentioned that, and you can almost see it in this picture, that he had this kind of penetrating look that he would fix upon you when he was really trying to make a point. So what was he like? Was he brilliant? Was he demanding? Was he encouraging, unforgettable? What was it about him?
He was brilliant to an extent, but not the most brilliant. What he was good at doing was spotting brilliance and bringing that brilliance on in other people. I mean, David Wheeler was brilliant. Was he difficult? He wasn't. You thought he was difficult, but what he was firm in his views. And if he got an idea in his mind and he knew he was right, and very often not wrong. He would always listen, and he was prepared to adopt a different view. Was he demanding? What he was a very skilled manager. He knew how to get people to do things and how to encourage them to do things. The most difficult person to manage ever was David Wheeler, without a doubt. David would not do things unless he really had to. And there's at least two examples of where Maurice found a technique of getting David to do what he wanted him to do. What he would do with Maurice was, when he wanted David to design a piece of equipment, like a multiplexer or something for a machine, Maurice would sit down and design it himself. He knew the design wasn't very good, and he would show it to David, saying, "I think we should do that. What do you think?" And David would get very cross very quickly and say, "This is how you do it." And Maurice had won.
All right, so 60 years on, it's May 6, 2009, 60 years to the day since that first calculation.
Yep.
The Cambridge Computer Lab holds a seminar, a celebratory seminar, at which Sir Maurice is present. And there are special presentations. Professor David Barron, Doran Swade made a presentation as well. And we have a short speech that Sir Maurice made. This is 2009, not that long ago, the 6th of May. This was his last public presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen, what can I say but thank you. This very happy day for me. I'm proud of those early years. I'm delighted to find that David Barron retains his knack of speaking very clearly, very understandably, very simply, and yet very deeply. And his lecture brings back to my mind many earlier lectures I've heard him give, all in the same general style. And Doran Swade I've not heard speak so often, but I apologize if I said something discouraging about philosophy. I take it back, and I have been strengthened and supported by the philosophy I have heard. I think why the EDSAC project was so very successful, I think it was partly because although digital computers were very new, in fact digital computing using desk machines had been going on in Cambridge and in other similar centres for quite a long time. As a research student, I myself did my turn of computing using a desk machine. I knew the place, I knew that Cambridge was just full of young men with sums they wanted to do, not necessarily vast things, not numerical weather prediction and all that sort of thing, but rather simple sort of programming, calculation of an integral or something that would take a week or two with a desk machine. It could be done very quickly with a computer. And it was a definite feeling of everyone in the lab that as soon as we got used to having a computer, a running computer, and had learned how to use it, and there we had, of course, the strength of David Wheeler, all we had to do was to open the lab to anyone with interesting problems, useful problems that were within the range of the machine, and let them come in and do their best. And of course they flooded in. In order to make it not absolutely too easy, we had a committee called the Priorities Committee, perhaps a rather frightening name. It was intended to be. In fact, it was a wonderful club. I used to look forward with great eagerness to the meetings because there were a lot of applicants coming along most anxious to be able to put their hands on this computer, and they were willing to take the time and trouble to explain to us what they were doing, what their aims were and so on. And we learned a very great deal about the research that was going on in Cambridge.
I have two reactions. One is, and we sort of exchanged a moment here, that was definitely that look at the beginning of his remarks as he was standing there looking at the...
He turned to the audience, he pulled himself up, and he looked everybody in the eye.
Yeah.
And that was as though to say, I'm here, I'm back.
And the second thing was, I love the line about all we really had to do was just open the lab, just open EDSAC and invite people to come in and work on it and solve their problems. What a tremendously open attitude to have had.
But what had to go with that was a lot of other researchers in programming techniques to help them do their work. And that was, as I said earlier, I think their contributions on the programming side were just as important as they were on the hardware side.
So one final thought before we get to the audience questions. Here's the famous green door at the Mass Lab. So please tell us about that.
The original building that housed the EDSAC had been an anatomy laboratory. It was distinguished by the fact the only elevator it had in it was for horizontal people, not vertical ones. And it was a nondescript building, and it had two entrances, one in the courtyard and one on the street side in Cambridge, quite a small street, and there was this very grey, dirty wall, and in the middle was a door, the green door, which is mentioned, by the way, in Fred Hoyle's book about the Black Cloud. That lab was demolished in 1969 to make way for a new mass lab. And as they were demolishing it, the chief engineer noticed the door lying in a skip. So he took it out of the skip and hid it. Thought we'd better keep that. And put it in the basement of the new building, where it rested for 11 years. But when Maurice retired in 1980, we gave him a party and a presentation. But we had a second presentation. It was in a garden of a college that was happening. And at the right cue, two rather tough engineers came running round the bush, carrying the door, on which we'd screwed a brass plaque, which you can see, and which we'd engraved Maurice's name, and we presented it to him. We said, Maurice, here you are, but on one condition, you can't take it away. And then thereafter, there's a tradition now in the mass lab, the computer lab, that when anyone retires who's been there long enough, their name is put on the door is taken out of its glass case where it now lives, and they are shown the door. And if I might add, I'm very proud that my name's on that door.
That's fantastic. This is a question I think people who are not steeped in history ask a lot, which is the UNIVAC is often listed as the first computer, or perhaps the ENIAC. What were the major differences between the UNIVAC and the computer at Cambridge?
So it's a good question, but there's no simple answer. And I think it's best not to say what was the first computer. There were lots of first computers. There were lots of computer pioneers. There was no computer father, certainly not Turing. But then the Turing name in Cambridge is not the favourite person because we revere Maurice. But the mathematicians revere Turing, quite rightly. They all together contributed. They were all pioneers. And we got there. And eventually, after EDSAC went to Leo, the Manchester stuff went to Ferranti, and there's whatever happened here too, of course, in the States, and I'm not a scholar in that. So there were great pioneering days. There was no first. There was no first man. There were a lot of them.
This is a more metaphysical, I think. What problems in either hardware or software remain to be solved for the general user, and how, in particular, do you think Sir Maurice would respond to that?
Well, how I would respond, I will respond, and I bet I learnt it from him. There is an unlimited set of problems that computers have not yet solved. That there's no doubt. There's no limit. And as technology gets bigger and faster and cheaper and everything else, we expand the universe of the areas we can tackle. So I'm sure there's no limit. I'm sure that there's no knowing what's going to come next. Computing, to my mind, has always surprised us by going off and doing what it's done. Every person who's tried to predict computing has probably got it wrong. Was it Turing who said that we would have artificial intelligence by the year 2000? He was totally wrong, and he was not the only person to be wrong. But to my mind, what's fascinating about computing is you don't know what's going to happen. It surprises us. I mean, who would have known about FaceTube and YouTube and Facebook and all that? I mean, they're just totally, no one thought of them. Right. And that, to my mind, is the excitement of computing, and I'm sure Maurice would have shared that.
Well, you've come a long way to give us a fascinating look at a tremendous life from someone who was so close to him for so long. So you've made us also, I think, feel like we're somehow part of this international celebration of his life and work that's taking place this year. So please know how grateful we are. You're a good friend of the museum, and we thank you so much for coming, David. Thank you.
The story of Sir Maurice Wilkes reminds us that the roots of computing are global and its early pioneers were unique and compelling. Explore the history of computing, and you'll connect the past to the future. See you next time on the Computer History Museum presents Revolutionaries.